Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment here. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar series. This is the third in a series of 4 webinars hosted by the EarthScope-operated NSF National Geophysical Facility and CUAHSI. Before I hand things off to our lovely speakers for today, we're going to give a brief overview of our respective organizations. Just a quick note here, we expect that all involved with CUAHSI-Cyber seminars uphold the CUAHSI Code of Conduct and promote and maintain a professional, considerate, respectful virtual environment. So thank you for being a part of that. My name is Julia Masterman, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the training coordinator for CUAHSI. CUAHSI is a consortium of universities for the advancement of hydrologic science, and we're a nonprofit organization funded in part by the National Science Foundation. Our mission is to empower the water community and advance science through collaboration, infrastructure, and education. CUAHSI sustains infrastructure to enable research and collaboration. We host a data repository for water science data called Hydroshare. And by providing the support and infrastructure, CUAHSI can help researchers formulate and execute their data management plans, be effective data stewards, and meet the requirements of publishers and funding agencies. CUAHSI also provides educational opportunities and infrastructure for student support. These include workshops, a summer institute for graduate students, webinar series and events like this one, a virtual university, and more. Both our data infrastructure and educational opportunities are designed to enable collaboration and interdisciplinary work. There are a few upcoming deadlines I want to point you towards. Firstly, we are now accepting module proposals from instructors for the CUAHSI Virtual University. This has been a program that's been hosted for nearly 9 years now. It's an interinstitutional graduate education program where professors teach 4-week graduate level courses that are focused on a specialized topic. As an instructor, you can expand your instructional impact, teach a specialized course that might not be otherwise available in a department, broaden your network, and enhance the depth and breadth of graduate course offerings in your department. If you're interested in learning more, please feel free to reach out to me, check out our website, and the application form will be open through mid-March. We also have another webinar series. If you're missing us next week, we'll be hosting a webinar with Neon. We'd encourage you to tune into this if you're interested, that CUAHSI is hosting. And I'd encourage you to sign up for our mailing list if you're not already, and connect with us on social media. And we look forward to having you as a part of our community if you're not already. Thanks so much.
All right, and if you're not familiar with us already, the NSF National Geophysical Facility, operated by EarthScope Consortium, supports research across the geosciences using geophysical tools. I'm Scott Johnson, joined by Emily Zawacki today. We're both Science Communication Associates at EarthScope. We were funded in 2025, and the NSF NGF provides instrumentation, data access, and educational resources for researchers, local governments, educators, and students, in addition to other users. And just one quick note from us, we are still currently recruiting research mentors, especially those with geophysics-related projects for our summer internship programs. Mentors do have to be based at a US institution, but please submit the mentor application at our website if you're interested in that. We can reach out and talk about how that might work. We'll put a link in the chat in a minute.
All right. So this webinar is part of a 4-part series. We hope that you'll join us in 2 weeks on March 11th for the final webinar in this series about building skills and finding collaborators. That webinar will be more of a panel discussion style webinar, and we hope that you'll join us for that concluding event in this series. The series as a whole aims to highlight work being done at the intersection of hydrology and geophysics and foster collaboration between geophysicists and hydrologists to broaden critical zone scientific communities. And today's webinar is on innovative technical tools and methods. A huge thank you to our speakers for taking the time to join us today. As we get started here, a couple logistics. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CUAHSI YouTube channel and also be findable via the EarthScope presentations channel. Secondly, we ask that you use the Q&A functionality to submit questions to our speakers. Please feel free to add questions at any time and upvote any that are especially of interest. We'll do our best to get to as many as possible in the latter half of this webinar. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Kamini Singha. Kamini, if you want to start messing with the screen share in the meantime, but Dr. Kamini Singha is a distinguished professor and associate dean of Earth and Society programs at Colorado School of Mines. She researches physical hydrologic processes on the surface and within Earth's subsurface. Her techniques integrate geophysical, hydrologic, and mathematical simulations to explore a wide variety of critical zone processes. Thanks so much for being with us today. And with that, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining. It's super fun to be here. What a fun audience. People that are learning hydrology and people that are learning geophysics all in one place. This is my bag. So nice to see many of you here and some familiar names. That's really fun. So I'm going to talk a little bit about geophysics in water science, and I'm going to focus mostly on electrical methods. And the reason for that is that Steve Holbrook, who I saw in here, hi Steve, did such a nice job on seismic in the first webinar. If you're interested in that, you should go back and take a look at that if you're interested in that. And I thought it would be a chance to talk about some other methods. Staying ground-based though, primarily until the very end. So I sit at this interface between hydrology and geophysics, but most of the questions I ask are motivated by hydrologic questions. And I use geophysics as a tool to try to tease apart some of the hypotheses that we put forward. And so there's all kinds of things that we as hydrologists are interested in. And I'm mostly a groundwater hydrologist, which means I'm interested in stuff below ground, where we're super limited in terms of the data that we have. We've got holes in the ground that we can dig, we can put, wells in, but there's a limit to what we can see. And that's where these geophysical tools can be super helpful, especially if we're thinking about numerical modeling at scale. It can help interpolate over zones that are sort of at the right scale for those models. And there's all kinds of things we'd be interested in knowing, like water tables and porosity and permeability. We'd love to know about bulk density, the chemical or the mineralogical composition of the subsurface, distributions of roots. There's all kinds of things. And not that geophysics can do all of these, but it might help us start to get at some of those pieces. So there are a lot of geophysical methods that are commonly used in hydrology. I list what I think are some of the most common methods here. And what you'll notice is that these methods on the leftmost column are sensitive to something in the secondmost column, but what we're really interested in is often in the farthest right column. And that link from second column to third column is actually is a complicated link. And I don't have enough time in this very short talk to talk about this, but let me just give you the sort of overview highlight of the issue, which is that we're interested in some, what I'm going to call it truth, hydrologic truth. We're interested in some map of moisture content over the top, however many meters of the subsurface. And in this case, I'm showing you an example with boreholes. So what we would generally do is we would collect geophysical data and then we'd invert those data. In other words, we're taking data and turning them into a model, and we'd have a map then of the subsurface of some geophysical parameter of interest. But what we want is to get back to, say, moisture content. Today's talk is mostly about electrical methods, so this geophysical map would be of electrical conductivity or its reciprocal electrical resistivity, but what we want to get back to is moisture. So then what we do is we take some sort of rock physics relationship to get back to that truth. So there's all kinds of rock physics relationships out there. People have spend their whole careers working on rock physics relationships. But the image here from the first to the third is the thing I want you to think about, which is that those images that we make, this is really for those of you coming from a hydrologic background, are sort of like the beer goggles version of what's happening in the subsurface. Everything's a little bit too blurry. Our high values tend to be underestimated. Our low values tend to be overestimated, and everything's a little bit smeared out. And so that means from a hydrologic perspective, getting quantitative values out of these data, it can be quite challenging. That said, we have been able to make all kinds of contributions to understanding hydrologic process. And one way we've done this, especially with electrical methods, is really to lean into time lapse. So leaning into the idea of changes through time, where we can difference out background data. So these are some old data that John Nimmo led many years ago out in the Mojave Desert. And what you see in the image, in the photograph in the center, is an infiltration ring made out of non-metallic materials. One catch with using electrical methods is that it's sensitive to things that are metal. And you've got a bunch of electrodes floating all over the place here. And the idea was to look at infiltration patterns in the desert because how moisture was being held controlled some species of plants that were there and was related to a tortoise population in some way. I don't entirely remember the details of. But what you see in these two images is there are two columns of data here from two different sites. And if you look down the column of site one, what you're seeing is a cross section of the Earth that's quite shallow, really small here, where you're seeing that infiltration, you're seeing that water go into the subsurface. And so what you see in site one is pretty much how we think about infiltration in the Vado zone. We describe it in classes as like 1D plug flow, and that's more or less what you see here. But what you see in site two is actually a little bit different. There's a bit more heterogeneity and structure to that moisture, and it sticks around for a little bit longer. And the reason is that the amount of pedogenesis, or the development of the soils in these two cases, are really different. Where in site one, it was a pretty young soil, and in site two, it's quite a bit older. And so by being able to sort of see into the subsurface, we can get a sense of how that moisture holds, for example, in conditions where we're interested in, say, crop or plant water use. We've also used these methods for years to look at groundwater surface water exchange. These are data that were collected by a former postdoc of mine, Joel Singley, here in Colorado. And so what we often do is dope a stream. We introduce either usually a salt of some sort into that stream, up gradient. And then what we can do is take a look at how that salt leaves the stream and moves into the aquifer surrounding that area. The reason we care about that is a biogeochemical hotspot. There's big gradients in dissolved oxygen and organic matter. And so understanding how big that zone of exchange is between surface water and groundwater is super important to figuring out things like nutrient uptake and metal processing, thermal, refugia for fish, for example. But one of the things you see in this is that sort of blurriness that I talked about before. And so trying to figure out like what is the actual extent of this hypereic zone, for example, is something that's often somewhat qualitative. He's drawn a couple of lines here at 10% and 20% change. And the question is like, how big is this zone? How much area do we have to do work from a biogeochemical sense? And it's not always obvious from these data. I will say, though, that people have done some really cool things through the years. This is a data set from an Italian group led by Giorgio Cassiani some years ago, but it was one of the first papers that took a look at the idea of sort of active rooting depths of plants. And so what you're seeing here is the irrigation of a couple meter tall apple tree with two drippers. And they use sort of the standard flow rate for apple tree irrigation in this case. And what you're seeing are the change around the drippers, right? You're seeing that penetration going into the subsurface at 30 to 40 centimeters. And that was the depth at which these apple trees, they interpreted, were taking water up. So one of the things that's quite hard for us to do in geophysics and hydrogeology is, say, mapping roots. Most of the roots we care about are too fine and too small for us to see. But maybe we don't actually need to map the roots if we know where the roots are active. And so this was one of the first papers that actually did that, to get a sense of where moisture was moving into the subsurface. And from that, they could intuit where plants were taking up that water. We've pushed on that through the years. This is some work led by Carla Jarecki, who was also a postdoc working with me a couple of years ago, looking at woody encroachment. And this is happening in a lot of the prairies here in the US. And what's happening is that woody shrubs are taking over where native grasses used to be. And those coarse roots, that come with those woody shrubs are changing the permeability of the soils and is changing the partitioning of water as it comes in, which changes how much water gets to water tables, the sort of reactive transport that happens in the subsurface, how carbon moves, how that carbon gets into streams. And so one of the things that she had done as part of her work is she simulated rainfall. There's two little nozzles up here at the top that are supposed to indicate her sort of simulated rainfall. And she looked at the soils beneath these woody shrubs and beneath these native grasses to take a look at the sort of rooting underneath those two ecosystems. And what she found is, not surprisingly, that roots, when you have bigger, coarser roots, they serve as a pathway for moisture into the subsurface, and they increase the amount of storage that's there. And that has a whole bunch of controls. You can see that both sort of qualitatively in these images at the top. You see a change in electrical resistivity here. Again, that idea of differencing through time, looking at separating out the background conditions. And that's sort of more quantitative down here in the bottom, where you're seeing a depth averaged time series through those electrical inversions, through those models through time. And you can see that in the woody encroached area at the bottom, you see notably more depth than you do underneath those native grasses. There's also some hope, I think, for the idea of reactive transport. This is a hard problem for geophysics, but this paper I thought was one of the coolest ones. It was done in a large scale, like lab scale lysimeter. And these, again, are electrical models made from data looking at nitrogen applications here. And so there's two red lines on each of these tomograms, which indicate where this fertilizer was being added. And this is an unsaturated lysimeter, I should point out. So there are some changes here in moisture associated with the introduction, but there's really large changes in electrical conductivity as a function of the fact that this fertilizer is coming into place. And so what you see on the left-hand side here is you see concentrations of nitrate, which is reactive, bromide, which is not. You see the estimated concentrations, basically a proxy for concentrations in the conductivity from the electrical resistivity data. And you see tails in the fertilizer concentrations that you don't see in the conservative bromide transport. So for the geophysicists, you see these higher concentrations at late time than you do in the bromide data. And so that implies that there's something here that's different between what's happening in the conservative, or the tracer that's just moving through, and the one that's reacting. And so what's happening here is that they are actually sensitive to the fact that the electrical resistivity is producing ions associated with that nitrate production. So you're looking at transport of a reactive species. This is work that was led out of Lee Slater's group at Rutgers. And I know I don't have a lot of time, so to sort of close this thing out, one of the issues that we have is that one could argue that no one really cares about this really small plot of land that you are measuring. And I will throw myself under the bus here. This was work that I collected as part of my PhD. It's pretty small scale. And so one of the big pushes right now is thinking about how we scale up. The problem with a lot of remote sensing tools is that satellites are really only sensitive to the top few centimeters of the Earth, with the exception of things like GRACE, which then have giant footprints. And so how do we get the sort of right scale for a lot of the management and policy decisions that we make in hydrology? And I think drone-based geophysics is probably a way that will help us get to that. And so that's, I think, the next horizon is sort of as drone-based geophysics. But until then, what we've been doing to date is some airborne work. This is an image that Burke Mensley at the USGS made, where he shows from what we can sort of cover in a day here on the bottom image, collecting electrical resistivity data. This is in Alaska. You see a permafrost, you see a lake talic, which is a fancy word for saying unfrozen stuff. So this is what we could collect in a typical day in the field. And at the same site, this is what we would be able to collect over that same landscape with airborne methods. So these are helicopter-based methods, for example. They're quite expensive to fly in terms of mobilization costs, but in terms of a per kilometer basis, there's nothing cheaper in geophysics. And there's been some great studies going back to one of the earliest ones that I remember here. Jared Abraham led this work from the USGS, looking at some work in Nebraska. Back in 2007, Nebraska was the top irrigator in the US. They were surpassing California and Texas. And it was partially because the cost of water in Nebraska was super cheap. It was a fraction of what it was in California and Texas. And so there was a law passed back in 2004 that was meant to strike a balance in Nebraska between sort of water supply and water demand, and put a cap on new irrigation. But they couldn't figure out exactly which aquifers were going to need management. And so what they did is they flew this western part of the state with airborne electromagnetics. And if you zoom in, you can actually see a fair bit of structure in the subsurface here in ways that we wouldn't normally have. All those little dots in the background, I should have pointed out, were borehole data. So they had boat tons of borehole data, but it was still inadequate to figure out the information they needed to calibrate the flow models that they were trying to build for this area. And so these airborne electromagnetic data, I think, provide some really high resolution data on, say, like aquifer geometry, which is super important to our models, just knowing where the bottom is, forgetting even hydraulic properties. And by using these data in their models, they were able to actually get flow directions and magnitudes right for the first time. So I think there's some really exciting things. I saw Jim Butler on here too. Hi, Jim. I know he's doing a lot of work on this now in Kansas. So short version, I think there's lots of applications for geophysics. There's so many things we can do in hydrology in terms of testing conceptual models that currently exist where we wouldn't have data as hydrologists. But from a geophysical perspective, I think there's a ton of work still to be done on those rock physics relationships, how we extrapolate those up, and moving to larger scales. And with that, I'm very happy to hand it over to Shujuan, who is going to do that. So let me get out of here if I can figure out how to do that.
Great. Thank you very much. If you have any questions for Kamini, please put them in the Q&A. We're going to get to as many of those as we can at the end of this. But for right now, we're going to move on to our next speaker. So I would like to introduce Shujuan Mao, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research lies at the intersection of seismology, hydrogeology, and energy sciences, and she aims to advance knowledge of how Earth's shallow fluid systems change over space and time related to geophysical and hydrological phenomena. So please take it away.
Could you see my screen?
Yeah,
Okay.
you're good.
Thank you, Scott, for the kind introduction, and thank you to EarthScope and CUAHSI for inviting me to this webinar. My name is Shujuan Mao. I'm an assistant professor at University of Texas in Austin. I'm a seismologist working on near-surface imaging and monitoring. Today, I will focus on how the innovative time-lapse seismic methods, or the so-called passive 4D seismology methods, can help us monitor water system and to complement traditional hydro data or simulations. So let's start by thinking about hydrological monitoring across scales. Traditional hydro data, as Kamini mentioned, are point scale, providing very direct in situ measurements, but the sampling rate in space can be quite sparse. Kamini talked about local scale measurements, or the classic methods for hydrogeophysics. Say these are looking at, say, spatial scale from about 0.5 meter to a few kilometers. As Kamini showcased, various geophysical methods enable very high resolution imaging of subsurface. Today, I will focus on regional scale, roughly from about 0.1 kilometer to hundreds of kilometers. So this scale pertains to the so-called watershed or catchment scale, which in practice is very useful for water resource management. There is a wide range of geodetic and seismological tools useful at this scale. In the first webinar of this series, Dr. Hilary Martins gave a very nice overview of geodetic measurements and a detailed introduction to GNSS methods, so I'll skip that part. Today, I will focus on the fast emerging four-dimensional seismology methods. So here, four-dimensional includes 3 dimensions in space plus 1 dimension in time. So it's a kind of spatial temporal passive seismic measurement. So the question is how to monitor seismic properties continuously in time at field scale. The basic idea is that our ground surface is varying all the time, everywhere, due to all sorts of sources. It's just most of the time, these ambient vibrations are so weak and they appear random and noisy. So they are considered to be ambient noise rather than signals by traditional seismologists. But in recent years, seismologists have shown mathematically that by calculating wave interference between the noise records at 2 seismic receivers, we can actually retrieve something meaningful, as shown on the top panel, the black waveforms. That is the Green's function. If you look at just the causal part of this Green's function, it is as if there is an impulse source at one receiver and what you will receive at the other receiver as the seismic response. So this approach has really been a game changer in seismologists because it means that we seismologists no longer rely on earthquake or active sources. Now, wherever we want to study, we just plug in two seismometers and calculate the wave interference, and we get all the data we want. We don't need destructive or time and space limited earthquake sources. So this is a very cost-effective and non-destructive approach, very suitable for long-term monitoring purposes. If we do this interferometry repeatedly on different dates, we could retrieve the Green's functions on consecutive dates. Then the second step would be the so-called coda wave interferometry. So coda waves are these late arrivals on seismograms. These waves are from the waves that have been scattered a lot of times in the subsurface due to some small-scale heterogeneities before they are picked up by surface seismometers. So if we compare the coda waveforms retrieved from ambient noise interferometry on different days, we can calculate the relative time shifts between these coda waveforms, which is just the opposite of relative seismic velocity changes. There are a lot of advantages of using coda waves. One is its high sensitivity because coda waves are, they travel a long path in the subsurface, so they sample the medium property redundantly. That is, if there is a tiny change in the medium property, it will be reflected as a big time shift on the coda waveform. This allows us to detect very tiny changes on the order of 0.01% of velocity change, which is very important if we want to monitor, say, daily, weekly changes in the subsurface medium. I also want to note that in very recent years, the ambient noise community, including myself, have been trying to push forward this approach by not only detecting the temporal changes of the seismic velocity change, the delta V over V, but also to image this delta V over V in space. This benefits from very recent development of theoretical descriptions of coda waves travel paths. So with that, I'll showcase what we can obtain with this approach. So this is a case study in Greater Los Angeles where we used about 60 broadband seismometers operated by USGS and Caltech. All these seismometers are in place. They were initially designed for earthquake monitoring, but now we can use that for hydro monitoring. So on the right-hand side, the blue curve is the seismic delta V over V we derived from the ambient noise records of from the broadband seismometers from early 2000 to the end of 2020. In comparison, the yellow curve is the hydraulic head data inferred from a dedicated monitoring well in Santa Ana Basin in Greater Los Angeles. And you could see over the past 2 decades, these two match very well with each other, both regarding the long-term variations and the short-term seasonal fluctuations, which is very encouraging for us because it means that we can potentially leverage a large number of surface seismometers as alternative to groundwater monitoring wells, which will significantly increase the spatial temporal resolution of hydraulic head data while avoiding the expensive cost of drilling and maintaining dedicated monitoring wells. So this is one comparison in just one basin because, say, benefiting from the spatial temporal ability of doing dV over V, we can now do that across different, say, sub-basins. Now, different panels are comparisons between seismic delta V over V in dark blue line, hydraulic head data in cyan circled line, and the red line is the estimated storage changes based on groundwater flow simulations. So at this sub-watershed scale, you could see across different basins, the long-term behavior of hydraulic head data are actually quite different. This is due to the different water management practices in different basins. But across different time, across different basins, seismic delta V over V is always able to retrieve the sub-basin scale hydraulic head data. which is very encouraging for us. So far I've been talking about temporal changes. Now let's move on to the imaging. We can also do the cold wave imaging to project the dV over V in space. So here is an example showing the net change of seismic delta V over V in Greater Los Angeles from 2000 to 2020. The blue color indicates a cumulative increase, and the red color a cumulative decline in groundwater. So this map shows that in San Gabriel and LA Central basins, there is much less water in recent years than 20 years ago, whereas in Santa Ana Basin, with the cyan color, it seems the water storage managed to keep a balance even with a slight increase. I want to note that the boundary between Santa Ana and LA Central basins, this gradient or this boundary is not a fault, not a natural barrier for groundwater flow. This is purely municipal. This is the county line between Los Angeles County and Orange County. The long-term, very big difference, very big contrast between these two basins is really due to the different water management practices in the two corresponding water districts. For example, in Santa Ana Basin, which is managed by Orange County Water District, they have a lot of sustainable water management programs. For example, they've built all these surface ponds to facilitate recharge of groundwater, and they also have deep groundwater injection wells to promote when they purchase some water somewhere else and transport water through California aqueduct to Santa Ana Basin, they can recharge their aquifers directly with all these sustainable programs. I also want to note two minor features reflected in this map. The cyan color close to the coast is the LA West Coast Basin. So here, because of the risk of seawater intrusion, they've been injecting water to mitigate the saltwater intrusion. And that's why we observe a cyan color in this basin cut off by the Newport-Inglewood Fault from LA Central Basin. Even minor feature is this yellowish corner here. This used to be a military site, meaning contaminated groundwater. So at this area, the Orange Water District, they've been pumping water on purpose to create a gradient so that the contaminated groundwater doesn't flow back to contaminate the entire Santa Ana Basin. So based on this type of imaging, you could see the significant role of anthropogenic activities in shaping the shallow hydrological system, compounding the effect of climate change. And this anthropogenic impact can now be verified and quantified by passive seismic data using 4D seismology methods without the need of drilling hundreds of wells, say, across Greater Los Angeles. So you could see the passive seismic can serve as a new way for assessing groundwater budget complementary to hydro data or simulations based on surface water data or borehole data. I also wanted to compare with a larger scale. We know satellite gravimetry is the German-US dual satellite missions launched in 2002. It allows us to monitor the terrestrial water storage from continental to global scale. By terrestrial water storage, it means everything that could induce a mass change, including groundwater, soil moisture, snow water, and surface water. The intrinsic spatial resolution of GRACE or satellite gravimetry is about 300 kilometers, but there are a lot of efforts going on trying to downscaling GRACE data and combining GRACE data with GNSS data or other types of geodetic data. So here is a comparison. The purple line is the water equivalent thickness derived from satellite gravimetry, and the blue line is seismic delta V over V obtained using all the seismic stations across Greater Los Angeles. So you could see these two match very well with each other. This reflects a regional scale or larger scale comparison. The GRACE pixel is across samples a broader area, and inside this pixel there are still pretty strong spatial variability. So in this sense, seismic passive data can be very complementary to the large-scale satellite data to aid in local water resource management, which requires really sub-basin scale or sub-watershed scale measurements. So I also want to note the satellite data, they are vertically integrated data at the surface. But with seismic, one very important advantage is that seismic waves of different frequencies, they probe subsurface at different depths. So with different frequencies, we can actually derive the seismic hydrographs or measurement across different depths. We call this vertical seismic hydrographs. This could directly constrain the changes occurring at different depths. So looking forward, one challenge of applying this 4D seismic for long-term hydrological monitoring would be the fact that seismologically active areas is not necessarily hydrologically interesting areas. If you look at the existing seismic network worldwide, some places like Taiwan, there are interesting hydrological problems, but some places like Central Valley, there are not many earthquakes, not many existing seismometers. So for local or small-scale hydrological applications, there are also nodal seismic sensors, very portable, easy to deploy. I showed this stride type of sensor showcased by Steve in the first webinar. So this can provide very feasible in a pathway to hydrological applications using passive seismic methods. And also in very recent years, there is the rapidly growing technology, distributed acoustic sensing, which basically turns a fiber into a very dense seismic line. So this allows very high resolution subsurface imaging and monitoring. There are these two publications showcase very high resolution detection of precipitation events or soil moisture based on repurposing telecommunication fiber data. We at the along the Sand Hill Road in California, we also had this work of using vehicle-induced surface wave to do repeated full waveform inversion, which allows us to retrieve the groundwater head data just based on passive seismic data reported by the fibers. So with that, I will end here by showcasing the spatial temporal type of product we can obtain, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Mao, for that great presentation. Thank you for Dr. Singha as well. If you have any questions for either of our speakers, please put them in the Q&A. We'll get to that in a bit, but first we're going to start off with a little bit of a broader discussion questions with our two speakers. So I think something that we've seen come up throughout this webinar series is this discussion of spatial scales and this variability either in geodetic versus seismic methods or some kind of hydrologic versus geophysical questions that we're looking at. So I'm wondering, where do you see the biggest challenges or opportunities in connecting satellite or airborne scale observations with these near surface or site scale methods?
Shujuan, do you want to start?
Please go ahead, you can do.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective, one of the hardest things about a lot of the available large-scale data that we have, which is satellite-based, is that it, with the exception of what like Shujuan's talking about here, there's very little of it that actually relates to groundwater. And so much of the many platforms that exist to collect satellite-based data are really good at looking at vegetation type and cover and moisture and temperature and even soil moisture at the really shallow piece. But the groundwater piece of the story is really hard to get our hands around. And even when we get our hands around it, it's often a pretty big footprint. And so I think this is, what she's talking about is a really interesting, exciting scale that is useful and applicable. But I think that we've been struggling to, I think, get the right methods in the right places. So much of what I work on is much too small for the same, the other side of that problem. So I think a lot of it is having the sort of right methods for the questions that we're trying to ask to make decisions with.
Yes, I would totally agree. I think the important thing is to find the suitable problems using suitable methods, like for geodetic or 4D passive seismology methods. If we obtain all the measurement at, say, subwatershed scale, there are a lot of interesting problems related to water resource management. They potentially are not interested really at, point scale measurement, what is the head in someone's backyard, but more interested in, say, at a sub-basin scale, what is the storage changes. So this type of methods could be very useful for, say, local water management, local water resource management. And then classic hydrogeophysics method, if they do, very high resolution subsurface type of imaging and monitoring, that's very useful for understanding hydrological processes at, say, a physical process scale, and connect that with rock physics type of properties. So I do think there are different suite of interesting problems going on at different scales, but it's important to find the right problems with the right tools, I guess.
Okay, great. So we have a lot of people coming from very different backgrounds joining this webinar series. So say you're a hydrologist who is new to geophysics or kind of another related subdiscipline. What are the key questions you should really think about when selecting a geophysical method for a study? Thinking of either resolution, sensitivity, logistics, and how you go about it. What are some recommendations you might give in terms of how do you even start choosing a method?
Yes, that was a great list that you just started with, Emily. I think, the most important thing is the method that you are considering using sensitive to the property that you're interested in. There's been a long standing interest in hydrogeophysics, for example, for mapping contaminants. That's a hard problem. That's a really hard problem. I think actually Andy Binley once made the joke to me about trying to image NAPLs, like non-aqueous phase liquids with many geophysical methods. And he said, I think there's two chances, no chance and fat chance, right? And so I just think that there's certain things we can't do. And so being cognizant of like what that method is sensitive to, and even if it is sensitive to moisture or salinity or temperature, is the change that you're looking for something that you're going to be able to capture. And so I think that certainly if you're a hydrologist starting off in geophysics, like partnering with someone who knows that instrument can be a super great way to get started, get familiar with it until you feel like you're ready to launch. I think for most of us, taking on new disciplines and trying to do something creative and new with that can be quite difficult. And so I would certainly encourage any starting out hydrologist who's interested and has a problem to communicate with some geophysicists that might work in some of those methods of interest. Hopefully they can steer you either toward the method they use or toward something else.
Yes, I also agree. I think like different geophysical methods, as Kamini mentioned, they have very different sensitivities to different properties, and also different methods, they have different uncertainties, like geodetic or say GPS data or INSAR data, they could be affected by the troposphere type of error in seismic. Passive seismic, maybe the distribution of noise sources. I would say no, say geophysical approach is the best, and all of this is they are non-direct measurement of the subsurface properties. So I think the way to go is really to combine the various tools we have, various geophysical tools we have to constrain different physical properties and to help understanding what is really going on in the subsurface.
Okay, great. And so we'll do one more discussion question before we move on to our audience Q&A. So this is kind of looking ahead in the field as we try to, grow and increase this, intersection between hydrology and geophysics. Are there any technical or methodological innovations you can envision in the next 5 to 10 years that might transform this intersection field, either things that you see kind of emerging now or maybe gaps that could be filled?
So from a seismologist perspective, I'm really looking forward to the use of fiber optic sensing for hydro monitoring at large scale because say seismometers, they are not pre-existing everywhere, but fiber telecommunication fiber, they are already in place everywhere. So it really provides a potentially very scalable way to do hydro monitoring at large scale. Although there are challenges with repurposing telecommunication fibers for distributed acoustic sensing regarding fiber access, all the different say spectral response of the methods. But I think those are still high potential and could be a very scalable pathway forward.
Yeah, I guess I would say I mentioned drones briefly. I think as payloads on drones are becoming something that can carry geophysical instrumentation, that's going to be a game changer for at least sites that allow us to fly drones. The other thing I think that's a big shift that's happening in the community that's really great has been the continued evolution of open source software, making these tools available to communities that aren't writing their own code. I mean, for the longest time, we were all individually sort of writing our own codes or begging someone else to share with us. I think that really opens up the door for folks. And honestly, I think the things that EarthScope and CUAHSI do in terms of training are also really important and super helpful to the community. So, all of those things, I guess, were top of mind.
Okay, great. I'm going to hand it over to Julia now, who's going to go through audience Q&A. And if you still have a question, please put it in the Q&A and we'll try to get to it.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have quite a few of you attending. We have over 150 folks joining, so thank you for taking the time to join us today. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. And feel free to upvote any questions that you like as well. Okay, first question. There's Shujuan. What are the opportunities where a seismic network is very sparse, like 400 to 500 kilometers apart? And then what is the sensitivity of short period seismometers for hydrologic studies?
So for this type of 4D passive seismology in particular, we typically need to use the coda wave part from reconstructed Green's functions. The coda wave, one big difference from, say, ballistic surface wave, if you think about traditional or more classic ambient noise surface wave tomography, is that the coda waves decay quite fast with distance. So for me, with broadband seismometers, I never really be able to use seismometers that are, say, 50 kilometers away from each other. So typically I use, things within 50 kilometers. So if you only have seismic stations that are like 400, 500 kilometers, I probably would recommend using single station cross component type of cross correlation rather than cross station type of analysis. And regarding instruments, whether broadband or say short period, we've tried with short period geophones, actually at the geysers and now also at Kilauea, and they work pretty well. Sometimes we do need maybe one anchor broadband seismic stations to cross-correlate, say, the nodal or short period sensors with the broadband. But most of the time, the cross-correlations just between the nodes and the short period sensors work very well, especially if you're just looking at a few hundred meters depth.
Perfect. Thanks so much. All right. Next question, Natasha asks if, can either of the presenters speak to some of the geophysical methods that one would use in mountainous terrains? Where are the opportunities or known limitations? They're joining from British Columbia on the west side of Canada. Thanks.
Well, I mean, we do a lot of work in, in the mountainous regions of the Rockies. It depends a little bit on scale, right? I mean, you can use a lot of the ground-based methods in mountainous terrain. When things get really, really steep, we work at a field site in Oregon that's steep enough that we need ropes to go up and down the hill. We've had some troubles with inversion just because of that, the shape of the system. But at the larger scale, I mean, certainly people are also flying airborne methods around mountains. Sometimes the holes in the data are sort of over those mountainous regions. And I've seen people looking at sort of machine learning and AI as ways of trying to patch gaps for some of the AEM data, for example, in mountainous regions. But at the smaller scale, at the scale that I work at, certainly there's no limitations on being able to work in mountainous regions.
Right, I would say typically for seismometers, it's actually most ideal to put the seismometer box. So the coupling is very nice. So putting a seismometer in mountainous area is actually perfect. There are a lot of seismometers, for example, in Sierra Nevada, where we are trying to use that array to study the mountain recharge patterns. So I do think there is high potential for applying this type of technique in mountainous areas.
Thanks. All right. Next question is from Steve Holbrook. Thank you both for the great presentations. I have a question for Shujuan. While passive seismic inversions often show geographical, spatial changes in UTM-X and UTM-Y, it still seems rare to see inverted cross-sections that localize the changes accurately in depth. Lee et al. 2025 is a rare exception. What is the methodological or theoretical challenges that prevent inversions in depth?
So I would say there is, thanks Steve for mentioning that. So there is a difference, say, between the Haipeng et al. 2025 GRL paper and the type of 4D seismology thing I showed. The Lee et al. They basically apply, basically apply time-lapse full waveform inversion. So it's a true time-lapse like it's not 3D, it's 2D in space. Then the type of 4D passive seismology approach I showed is using coda wave inversions. The challenge of that is we don't know exactly the 3D kernels for coda waves. So that is some technical block we are facing. So our assumption is most of the coda wave we use based on the window is mostly on scattered surface waves. So we just use different frequency bands based on surface wave depth sensitivity kernels to look at the inversions at different depths. And I would also note that with this approach, we did try to do inversions across different depths. Say one of that is our 2022 paper where we actually observe a pretty different patterns across different depths, and some of which actually very nicely assemble what we observe with INSAR at the surface. Because INSAR, the displacement they infer at the surface is basically a vertically integrated string. So I hope that kind of answer your questions.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, and this one to Kamini. How sensitive is borehole NMR to get water content in subsurface? I believe in aquifers with the deep Fados zone, when monitoring is not present, we need some proxy approach to quantify water content in the unsaturated zone to isolate groundwater storage, change from GRACE, total water storage.
Okay, so there were a couple of thoughts in there. So one of them was around NMR and being able to use it to measure moisture content in the subsurface, and the other was times to GRACE. Did I catch that right, Julia?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't work much with NMR, to be honest. NMR is a really interesting, super cool tool. It's the only geophysical tool that's really sensitive to the presence of a water molecule. So that makes it unique, and it's not a proxy measure. It's not like electrical resistivity where you're looking at a change in conductivity and assuming that it becomes a change in moisture. So NMR is unique in that way. And so it's a really powerful tool for looking at subsurface moisture. And there's certainly many people nationwide. Andy Parsekian at the University of Wyoming was someone I would think of right off the top of my head, Daniela Rempe, the University of Texas, people that sort of work in this method all the time. So I think I missed part of the question, but yeah, but certainly you can use these you can use that as a method to measure moisture content. I missed something in that question. In terms of scaling that to GRACE, I have no idea how to do that. GRACE is at a footprint that is just so big that it is not a useful method to me. I don't know how to make the leap from the very small scales that I work at to the very large footprint of GRACE. GRACE is a super amazing tool. It is awesome, but it is covering, the pixel size is gigantic. It's I don't even actually Shujuan probably knows the exact pixel size. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's huge. It's like so big that it's like many watersheds that I would work in end up inside of the single pixel. And so if the question, if I caught it right, and apologies if I missed part of this question, but is about linking those two, I wouldn't even know where to start with that, to be honest, just because the scales are so far apart.
Yep, I think the question is kind of touching on that exact problem of when Grace total water storage is such a large quantity, how can you approach quantifying water content in the unsaturated zone with a really deep Fados zone to isolate groundwater storage change?
I mean, the other thing about Grace, and again, Shujuan can correct me on this, is also that you need there to be subsidence, right? And so is that right? You need there to actually be like deformation at the surface. And so I imagine that this is a method that works much better. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Shujuan. I'm like talking trash for what I know, but like that you need to have compression of an aquifer. And so if that's the case, that would probably be INSAR more than Grace. Grace can probably do either one, right? I was just trying to think about, I'm going to pass this over to my colleague who probably knows undoubtedly more about Grace than I do to answer some of these questions. I don't have an answer for this one. It's too far outside of what I do.
So I think, Grace, you're perfectly correct that it's INSAR that really requires deformation. So if, say, it's just changes in, say, saturation, then probably that does not induce enough deformation to be picked up by INSAR or GNSS. Grace by contrast, picks everything that induces mass changes. So that means, everything related to water, like the moisture changes, groundwater changes, surface water changes, snow water changes. It is challenging to isolate all the different components, but Grace people, they've been trying to do this based on, different type of modeling, and also sometimes to combine other geodetic like GNSS or INSAR data. So again, all the different components of the hydrological cycle, say, included in Grace, the estimation has different uncertainty. And so I would think the way to go forward is really to combine probably not only geodetic, different types of geodetic, but also try to combine seismic data, which does have a direct vertical resolution for all the different things happening at different depths.
Thanks. Okay, hopefully we got to the core of that question for that person. But probably this is going to be one of our last questions. What would the minimum time required to get a reliable Green's function to estimate the DVV that gives meaningful hydrologic information?
So for me, it really depends on the station density. If, say, using, say, permanent seismic network that with sensors that are like tens of kilometers away, we typically can at best get daily resolution. Of course, it's a trade-off between time resolution and say signal to noise ratio. If you stack or average over longer time duration, that reduces the time resolution but improves the signal to noise ratio. Then if we have really dense seismic array, we did an experiment with nodal sensors that are about 80 meters apart. And with that, we can get half-hour hourly resolution. So that density of seismic array really helps with time resolution.
All right, thanks. All right, now actually the very last question coming from Meredith. Could you please highlight any geophysical methods or satellite measurement missions focusing on tracking water flow on the surface rather than the subsurface? Many of the examples in these webinars have focused the subsurface below at the soil. Are there any researchers that focus on such methods for water above the surface?
Certainly there's satellite-based methods that NASA flies that look at soil moisture on the near surface. If you're looking at sort of larger scale surface water like lakes, aerial imagery might be your best bet. Part of the problem with trying to figure out like reservoir volumes or lake volumes from satellite-based methods is you still need to have some sense of depth, right? And so that's hard to get off of satellite-based methods. And so that is a limiting factor, certainly for large surface water bodies and estimating their, their volumes from satellite-based data. River flow, for example, I think these are river flow. I don't know how to do that with satellite-based methods. There might be something out there at the smaller scale for large rivers. Certainly for most of the rivers that I work in, which are headwater streams, there's no way. They're just way too small. But I think aerial imagery is probably one of your best bets, at least for some of these reservoir things. But again, that depth piece is a struggle. I'd be interested to hear what Shujuan thinks on that one.
I'm not very familiar with surface water. I'm more focused on groundwater. But as Kamini said, there are, I think, different type of data process, different data products using different, say, bands of satellite data to track some mostly focusing on surface water or soil moisture. But sorry, I'm not an expert on the surface water part.
Yeah, certainly some things like SWOT, for example, that NASA flies would be something that gets at surface water and soil moisture that might be of interest to you. I think part of the reason it's interesting you point out that so many of these talks have been about the subsurface, and I think it's because the data dearth is so real there that like so many of us are really interested in that place. But certainly there's a fair number of satellites that you could see if they're at the right sort of scale or footprint to you that NASA flies that might get you at some surface water or soil moisture information besides just aerial imagery.
Great. Thank you both so much for joining us today. This has been a great conversation and great presentations as well. We really appreciate your time. And thank you to our audience for joining. A reminder, in 2 weeks' time, we'll have our last webinar in this series. It'll be a panel discussion, and we hope that you'll join us for that last one as we culminate this series. We're hoping to help kind of build some collaborations and community surrounding this topic. So hope to see you in a few weeks and have a good rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much.